Welcome to Chapter 2, Overview of Effective Universal Instruction. My name is Cindy McKinney, and I'm the Program Director at Region 8 Service Center up in Northeast Indiana. Chapter 2 is all about the power of learning targets. So let's get started. I'm starting with a quote. It's a Viktor Frankl quote, so it's kind of deep, but I think it's important for what we're going to be talking about today. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. And when you walk into your classroom door every morning, you have meaning, you have purpose. And the argument that I'm going to try to make for you today with learning targets is that your students need meaning and your students need purpose as well. And that's why learning targets can be so pivotal for you as you build quality universal instruction. Another point that I want to bring to the table right up front is that your Indiana academic standards are not learning targets. They're the bigger piece that supersedes learning targets, but we're going to talk on the next slide about what learning targets are. So the statement at the top of this slide gives the book definition, and I think it's a right and proper definition that most of us have for what learning targets are in our districts. I have a different definition. I like to call learning targets digestible chunks within a standard that are broken down into a logical sequence for mastery. I'm going to say that again because I know it's kind of a mouthful. A digestible chunk within a standard that's broken down in a logical sequence of mastery. And the reason that I look at it that way is because when you start breaking down the standards into these digestible chunks that we are now calling learning targets, you can really use them to leverage your Tier 1 instruction in 4 different ways. The first way is pretty obvious. They are building blocks for your Tier 1 instruction. But when we get to deciding what curriculum and what resources we're going to use, most of the time, our first criteria is, well, are they aligned with the Indiana academic standards? And that's the criteria we use. And as long as what we're using is aligned with the standards, we say, okay, I guess this is good enough. My argument here is that when you break your standards down into learning targets, you can become much more granular and pickier about the curriculum that you choose, because it might be aligned with the standard in a broad way. But if you're focusing in on very specific learning targets, you can make much better decisions about the resources you're using. You can also use your learning targets as a reflection tool. So let's say that you have a data point, either a classroom data point or something that's larger, like a standardized test data point, that is pointing you in a positive direction, saying, hey, we're doing really well on this area. You can probably trace that good, strong performance all the way back to a good, strong learning target. The opposite is true as well. So if you have data points that you're not very excited about and that you're looking to increase, you need to trace it back to a learning target, meaning are the learning targets that are tied to this data point in digestible chunks within a standard that are broken down into a logical sequence for mastery. That also leads to that final point on the right, which is a good quality Tier 2 instruction. Let's look at an example. Let's say you have a standard that you have broken down into learning targets, and this is a common standard in early childhood areas, that students will orally read a grade level appropriate or higher level text smoothly and accurately with expression that connotates comprehension at an independent level. That's an actual standard that we have in Indiana. And you can tell when I read that standard, there's like 5 different learning targets that you have to unpack for that, right? So if you have 2 students that you're putting into Tier 2 intervention because they're not mastering that standard, one of those students might not be mastering that standard at the beginning levels of the learning targets, right? Maybe they have trouble with reading smoothly and reading accurately. So their intervention is going to be around smoothness and accuracy. Maybe you have another student that's not mastering that standard at a deeper level. They have their learning target struggles are around comprehension or independence. Well, those two tier 2 interventions are going to look very different, even though those students are in tier 2 intervention for mastery of the same standard. But we wouldn't know how to individualize it if we hadn't broken it down into learning targets. So let's move on and talk a little bit more about who should be developing the learning targets. So I used to think that in order for learning targets to be effective, each district had to develop their own targets. Like you just had to do it. Like it's just one of those embrace the suck kind of things, right? But after reading this chapter, I have moved a little on this. And I do believe that if creating your own learning targets is a barrier to you, if it's keeping you from quality tier 1 instruction, quality universal instruction, then look for others, look for other resources that already have them developed. Like let's go to what we need right now. And let's use them as an opportunity to affirm what we know. Make sure that our staff is affirming those targets and validates them as the targets that we want in the order that we want them, in the digestible chunks that we want them, to make sure that we are ensuring mastery. How should the learning targets be developed? Again, you got to consider time and resources. If you don't have the time, look for standards in another place, or look for targets in another place rather, or maybe you can just pick a few standards that you really want to break down into targets, like what are the most important ones. Another piece that I really liked from the book that the author shared with us is to involve a broad group of educators. And she listed 4 that are right there in that middle bullet point. She said you need to have content experts. These are deep awareness people. So these are people that really understand the content that you're unpacking the standards and creating targets around. You also need to have assessment experts. So maybe they don't know tons about a target or about the content, but they do know something about assessment, and they really have taken have an affinity for how to assess. Those people need to be on your team. You need to have a process facilitator. That's a person that's going to make sure that the standards and the targets that you're developing are research-based and are aligned strongly with what you're trying to do. So they're going to kind of be the gut check people in your group. And then you need to have somebody that's making sure you have the time and the energy and the resources to actually get the standards development and the target development done. So those 4 specific pieces are important on your teams. When you start developing standards, what should they look like, right? Like how do I know if I'm developing a good learning target? So to the left, you have some characteristics of what good learning targets look like. They need to be research-based. Right now, we have a lot of discussion in our state about science of reading. So do your standards align with some of the things that we're now learning about how kids learn how to read and need supports around reading? Are they internationally benchmarked, which means that the same kind of standards can be found in different countries with high academic achievement? The rigor component is about cognitive complexity. And I would argue that we do want our standards to be cognitively complex, but in order for students to be able to think deeper, they do have to have mastery of certain facts and certain vocabulary in order to master that. And that's, again, part of the learning target process is breaking down a standard and identifying the important vocabulary in the standard and how to get that vocabulary mastered to the point where students can have deeper conversations around them. Obviously, they need to be measurable, and we need to take the jargon out. To the right, we have, once we've created those standards, those learning targets, how are they aligned with all of the rest of what we have, right? So is there a vertical articulation between our learning targets? Like, is there a logical progression between grade levels? Do we have a scope and sequence, which is the horizontal grade level? That, to me, means if I have a science standard that I've unpacked into learning targets, and I have a math standard that I've unpacked into learning targets, and some of those science and math ones look very similar, can we combine them? Can we make them, can we maybe organize them in a way that they're taught simultaneously so that kids start to make those connections? That to me is really what a good scope and sequence does. Are they comprehensive? In my mind, comprehensive means that we really dig deeply into a few of them instead of, you know, the inch wide, mile deep concept. No, I think I have that reversed. The mile wide, inch deep concept. Okay, we want them to be comprehensive. So we want to pick a handful of standards that we know and are really important, develop learning targets around those standards, and really hit them every year because those are the critical ones. And are they coherent? Coherence to me is not necessarily coherence on the teacher's end, it's coherent on the student's end. Do students understand the interconnection of why they're learning what they're learning? And can they build meaning around what it is we're trying to share with them? So on our final slide, overviewing this chapter 2, I'm going to kind of reflect back to you. I'm going to ask you some questions. So when you think about learning targets that you have in your district right now, are your learning targets driving your curriculum decisions? Are they driving your instructional decisions in the classroom? Are they driving your assessment decisions? And are they engaging your students in learning? So those are 4 key pieces you want to think about your learning targets. And then if we want to increase the likelihood that they're going to be developed with fidelity, we've got to develop them collaboratively. Okay, we have to have all voices at the table. We need to engage in some professional learning around what good learning targets look like. Remember, the standards are not the targets. We need to bring student work and lessons to the table and talk about how our learning targets look in real world experiences and real world life. But also how they look in the classroom. Like, here's the learning target, and here's what the evidence is that my students are producing, that they've mastered that learning target. And we have to provide feedback to the systems to make sure that we can improve our learning targets over time based on what data we're collecting. So with that in mind, thanks for watching. And I leave you with this quote from our author, Sarah Brown. She says that prevention is the best intervention. And I totally agree with her on that. So use your learning targets as the foundation of your prevention, and enjoy the rest of the book.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I'm Marty Hoofer from Keep Indiana Learning, and great content today. Thank you. My 2 takeaways that I jotted down as you talked, and see if you want to elaborate on these any. I loved when you talked about using learning targets to make decisions. And I think specifically you were talking about resources, but I just thought, wow, how many times did I not do that as a teacher? Did I make decisions without taking my learning target in mind?
Yeah. Again, we tend to confuse learning targets with our standards. Our standards are not our learning targets. Our learning targets come from the standards, but they are digestible chunks that we organize in a logical way in order for our standards to be mastered. And once we understand that difference, everything else kind of falls into place and it makes much more sense.
And I also loved what you talked about with having a team to develop those learning targets. This isn't just one person sitting there by themselves. We all bring different strengths to the table, and we're also teaching a wide variety of students. So it only makes sense to bring a wide variety of minds to the table to develop the learning targets, since we're developing them for a broad audience.
Exactly. And since you have that broad group of people at the table, that means it might take a little bit more time. So you're going to have to pick strategically, which standards do we want to start unpacking? Like, which ones are the most important to us that we really need to get a handle on in our district, and that we're willing to spend, a lot of time developing some learning targets around, because we know that if we can get these standards right, so many of the other standards will just kind of fall into place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Cindy. We are continuing our work here through our Effective Universal Instruction book. Cindy was chapter 2. Mandy Isaac will be doing chapter 3. That will premiere on March 2nd at 11:30. So stay tuned for the next chapter here in Effective Universal Instruction. So thank you, Cindy, for your time today.
You're welcome.